Good evening. How are you all doing tonight? Excellent. My name is Joe Westfall, and it's been my honor to be the Deputy Director here for the last 8 years. It has been a great run. I do not miss the Pentagon. I want to welcome you today on behalf of the National Archives and Records Administration and the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum. I want to talk to you about a couple of our upcoming programs that we have coming up within the next month or so. On April 24th, we have Francois, who was evacuated during Operation New Life, became an American military officer, graduated from West Point, and will tell a truly unique and American story. And then, the following week, on April 30th, we will have here, very similar tonight, what I like to call one of those lecture rock stars. This particular one is Dr. Fred Logeval. He is a Harvard professor of history who won the Pulitzer Prize in 2013 for his book Embers of War. And on the very day that Saigon fell 50 years ago, Fred will do about a 25-minute lecture, and then he and I will discuss that fall of Saigon for a couple minutes after that, and then you will be able to ask questions of him. And Fred is one of the most amazing lecturers you will ever hear. On May 22nd, we will feature a film which is being offered to the Academy of Motion Pictures and will be in a running for an Academy Award for the next year in the short film category. This film is called On Healing Lands, Birds Perch. I have had a chance to preview it, and it is simply amazing. It tells the story of that photograph, yes, that photograph, the one which shocked the country, of a summary execution of a Viet Cong infiltrator during the Tet Offensive in 1968, a photo which won the Pulitzer Prize in 1969. It tells the story of the eyes through the family from both sides, on how they still deal with that incident 50 years later. That 30-minute film is powerful, it is emotional, and you should all be here that evening to watch it. And of course, I've already mentioned, and you most all know about this, come September, we'll take a little break for the summer, and that will be our last event. But comes the fall, you are all aware that I am the chairman of the Greatest Generation Celebration Committee, where we will have a week-long celebration. My work as well, and I continue to thank the Gerald R. Ford Foundation for their help with this, and Gleaves Whitney, who is an honorary member of that committee, and Brian Howenstein, who is one of my co-chairs. We are going to have the largest and the biggest thank you to the greatest generation of this nation. And with that, Mr. Gleaves Whitney, the Executive Director of the Ford Foundation, to introduce our wonderful lecturer tonight.
Good evening. Well, thank you, Joel, for that kind introduction and very vivid illustration of all the things that are coming up. And I always appreciate working with you and our talented colleagues at the National Archives, and we have a lot of good joint programming coming up. Also, many thanks to you for being here and to our C-SPAN audience on a very special day, because our C-SPAN viewers should realize that today we're celebrating First Lady Betty Ford. April 8th is the day today, and we have a tribute really for Betty Ford's 107th birthday. Isn't that great? Though she is not with us physically, she, believe me, is still here in spirit, and she so informs our hearts for the work that we do, the important work we do here at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation. I mean, she's just a rock star to us. So we have some Fords in the audience, in fact. There we got Greg Ford and Carla. Welcome here. So thanks for joining in the birthday celebration. So So I love to point out a statistic that I think surprises some people. In a recent survey of First Ladies, since 1965, Betty Ford came in #1, the most impactful First Lady in the last 6 decades. Think about that. Sure, why not? When you walk through the Ford Presidential Museum, you see why. It's not only in the wonderful exhibits that we have, and in the special exhibit that Morrell, for example, put together on Betty Ford, the Betty Blip, which has just been fantastic. It's not only that, but you also see it in the virtues that are literally written into the walls of this museum. Virtues like courage, candor, conviction, truth-telling, and a life of service, as the burial site puts it, to God, country, and love. That's what defined President and Mrs. Ford, lives devoted to those high ideals. These virtues remind us that there is much more to Betty Ford than a superb sense of style. After all, it was crafted in part by Martha Graham. So she had style, we know that. And we also know that she just showered the A-lists in the Washington social scene with a sparkling personality. But beneath that, at a deeper level, was an unshakable core of conviction. And that's what made her an invaluable public servant and friend to the American people. Gerald Ford often noted that Betty was the best of his advisors because there's no fear or favor, no guile in her relationship with him. She was fiercely independent in that relationship, and as I say, didn't need to curry any favor at all with him. She spoke her mind, and as Ford said in his inaugural remarks as our 38th president, and you see these words in stone out by the burial site, "I am indebted to no man and to only one woman, my dear wife, as I begin this very difficult job." Betty didn't seek the limelight, as you know. But boy, she didn't shy away from it once she had the opportunity to use it. And after several high-profile interviews in which she expressed unstinting support for the Equal Rights Amendment, one of Ford's cabinet members had the temerity to say to President Ford, "We have a campaign coming up, and she's been expressing her opinions pretty strongly, and that might hurt you in the polls." President Ford interrupted his cabinet member, and he said, "Well, that's your opinion, and if you want to express it to her, her office is right down the hall. Go to it." Well, during that campaign, Betty was actually a magnet for a lot of voters, and even literally a magnet, because it explains the impish campaign button that said, "I'm voting for Betty's husband." So when you survey all the First Ladies, Betty Ford sounds a lot like another amazing human being who's going to be mentioned tonight. So Abigail Adams, we're going to hear about, and I'm so glad that we have a wonderful speaker and scholar who can sympathize with both Abigail Adams and Betty Ford and see and perceive that they're really two of a kind in some very important ways. So here at the Ford, we're trying very intentionally to tie together 1776, I'm a historian, I wind back, 1776, which of course is the founding, with 1976, which is when President and Mrs. Ford helped lead Americans in their celebration of the bicentennial of this amazing country, to 2026, which is the semiquincentennial of our celebrations of 250 years of history, in which we've had some remarkable achievements and remarkable opportunities to redeem and repair some of the mistakes we've made. So with Lindsay Chervinsky, we are fortunate to have somebody who understands this golden thread that links these three dates. For Lindsay is like a one-person time machine. We got to spend a lot of time with her and some of our friends of Ford today, and she can address all three dates with authority. What Wikipedia will tell you about Dr. Chervinsky is that she is the executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library at Mount Vernon. Now, it's not in the NARA system, but it is a superb facility. How many of you have been to Mount Vernon? And I think well, Lindsay, just about everybody here has been there. And the library, I think, opened in 2013, correct? How many of you had the chance to see the library? Okay, you'll have a chance maybe to say something about that. We have a couple of people who have. And she's the author of the award-winning book, The Cabinet, George Washington and the Creation of American Institution. And I happened to go back today, preparing my remarks, to look at what Lindsay had said back in 2022 when she was here. And she said, looking forward to many future collaborations. Well, one of those is tonight, right? So we are so glad to have her back. And she will also be talking about her most recent book, Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Presidents that Forged the Republic. So this is a scholar who knows how to speak the common patois to us as we try to understand our remarkable history. What Wikipedia will not tell you about Lindsay, but you will discover when you encounter her writings and her in person and her lectures, her conversation, is that, remember I mentioned something about style earlier about Mrs. Ford? Well, you'll see that her writing style is punctuated with sparkling insights. And moreover, she shares many of the same core virtues that Abigail Adams and Betty Ford had. Lindsay has candor, truth-telling, courage, independence, love of country, the very traits that define this stage. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Lindsay Chervinsky.
Does anyone know the password to get on the computer for the images? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Sorry. Right here. Oh, right in front of me. Perfect. I like it. It's a good password. Okay. Excellent. Hello, everyone. It is a pleasure to be with you here tonight and to have an opportunity to talk about First Ladies in more detail. As I was saying earlier, Abigail Adams was by far the most fun part of this book to research and to write, but is sometimes squished into a couple of answers on a couple of questions. And so to really allow the First Ladies to come into their own this evening is a real treat for me. And it's a delight to be back here at the library. I first was able to visit Grand Rapids in 2022 to talk about the cabinet, and then came back, I think in 23 for a conference on the vice presidency. And so it is a delight to be back again. My plan is to give you some information about the First Ladies, but then, of course, to leave time for questions at the end. That is always my favorite part because I want to know what you want to know about, and I want to be able to give that information. I will remind you when we get to that point, but because C-SPAN is filming, we'll need you to speak your question into a microphone so that it will make sense to those who watch the program later. So when I think of First Ladies, I think that there are 3 early models. The first 3 First Ladies set sort of 3, if we think of a triangle of the options of what it meant to be the First Lady, they were all kind of polar, not opposites because there are 3 of them, but different in how they presented themselves, how they viewed the role, the responsibilities that they took on for themselves, and of course their relationships to their husbands. And then all of the First Ladies since then have sort of fallen into that triangle range. Very few have replicated the exact same model that have come before them, but have often kind of picked and choose different bits from the models that their predecessors embraced to make their office their own. Of course, the office of the First Lady is not in the Constitution. It is not written down. It has not been defined by statute, although there have now been some rules that have built out some funding for the office of the First Lady in the East Wing. And as such, it is often very difficult for First Ladies to figure out what they are supposed to do. And that is because the American people have a funny way of changing their mind, sometimes from day to day, sometimes from week to week, and sometimes from year to year. And those expectations can be incredibly hard to meet. So the first person to take on this role, the first person to establish what a first lady might be able to do, was Martha Washington. Martha Washington was born and raised in Virginia. She did not have much formal education, but like most elite white women at the time, she was taught reading, writing, and arithmetic so that she could manage the household accounts and manage the plantation and be a partner to her husband in that way. She excelled at these skills, and when her first husband, Daniel Parke Custis, died, she ably managed the plantation, actually generating a profit for several years as a widow. However, there's no evidence that she was really interested in politics. In fact, there's ample evidence that she disliked it an awful lot. She thought it was mean and dirty and sort of base. And so when she married George Washington and he became involved with politics, all evidence suggests that they had a warm and loving relationship that evolved over time. He wanted her with him every single year during the Revolution. When he went into winter quarters, he always asked her to come be there because she made it home. But we don't believe that they really discussed political affairs or military affairs. Instead, once he became the first president, she served a very important social role. The first thing she did was to present herself as a small r, virtuous Republican woman. And this was important because in the culture of early republic, there was this idea of Republican motherhood. And the idea was that if you were going to have a new nation, you needed to have women raise children and grandchildren that would be virtuous citizens. And so the best thing you could do as a mother would be to raise citizens that would bring the republic into the next generation. And so Martha embodied this. She intentionally often wore white, draping herself in layers of white fabric to evoke Roman matrons, and presented herself as sort of this warm, grandmotherly figure. She also, the second thing she did was to host a number of very important social events. In particular, her drawing rooms on Friday evenings. These were open to both men and women. She served lemonade and snacks, no alcohol, and no gambling was allowed. And the idea was that because women were present, this was not a political event. Because women were present, it was not a public event. It was semi-private, semi-public. And because she was the host, George Washington was there in his capacity as a private citizen. Now, this is not a distinction we would recognize today, right? When the president walks into a room, he's the president regardless of who is hosting the event. But it was a distinction that 18th century Americans recognized. And that meant that George Washington could walk up to senators and say, you know, that bill you're considering, I really think you should add more money to it because I need to be able to appoint a different ambassador, and the amount of money you've given to me is not sufficient. And in fact, we know he did just that. They raised the funds the next week, and he got his way. Had he been the host, it would have been seen as inappropriate politicking and inappropriate interference in the legislative branch. So these social events that women hosted gave people space to form the networks, the community, the relationships, the alliances that made politics actually function. And everyone present understood that that was how it worked. Everyone present understood that these semi-private events were essential to make early republic politics function. So that's model one. Model two is Abigail Adams. Now, Abigail Adams was very different in temperament from Martha. She also did not receive a formal education, but she was incredibly well-read. She was an autodidact. She taught herself a lot of history and languages. She was a voracious reader. And in her correspondence with John, you can see this sparkling intellect that just crackles as they are giving sort of quips back and forth about Roman references and Greek references and Cicero and Shakespeare. And so their relationship was very, very different. While she, of course, was not involved in politics, she had a lot of opinions, which I love about her. and she was not afraid to share them. Abigail Adams was known as a very sharp political mind. She was understood to be very savvy about the people around her. She was an excellent judge of character, and she was no holds bar in offering her assessment of what their character was, what their motivations were, and maybe what their secret motivations were. She also was excellent at offering very biting criticism and some really sharp takedowns in her letters. So all of the good stuff is in her correspondence. Now, at the time, Abigail was often called John. I loved when you, Leaves, were talking earlier about Betty being the most important advisor, because people at the time called Abigail John's cabinet of one. Now, this was meant as a criticism, and it was perhaps the most accurate criticism that was ever levied against John Adams, because indeed she was his most important advisor. A great story that demonstrates how close they were occurred in the summer of 1798. James McHenry, who was the Secretary of War, had been visiting with George Washington at Mount Vernon and came back to Philadelphia, where the seat of government was located at the time. The house on the left is the president's house. And McHenry came to visit. He came straight from the road, and he found Abigail and John having breakfast in the family dining room. He handed over a number of papers to John Adams, who read them and then handed them to Abigail. And she read them and offered her input. So her participation was not a secret in any way, and was regularly solicited by John Adams, but also by other people at the time who understood how much she had to offer. She did maintain a lot of the same social practices that Martha Washington had established, so she also hosted drawing rooms. She opened the president's house for open houses on New Year's Day and July 4th, and she was the hostess at state dinners, which were on Thursday evenings as well. However, her role was somewhat limited by her illness. And so here is an area where she did carve out a slightly different experience, in that she was not able to be with him all the time. She probably had a form of diabetes, and so it made her very susceptible to seasonal fevers. And if you lived in Philadelphia in August in 1798, when there was no running water, no sewage, and people tended to throw their garbage out behind their house, you can imagine how much mosquitoes enjoyed that environment. And mosquitoes spread things like yellow fever. And so when she was about halfway through the presidency, she stopped going as much to be with John, and they spent more time apart. And she spent most of her time here at Peacefield, which is their home in Quincy, Massachusetts, which, if you haven't visited, I highly recommend as another National Park Service site to see. It does really help us, I think, understand these people when we can see the environment they lived in. So that was sort of the model that Abigail carved out, one of incredible political awareness, incredible political participation within the confines of sort of gender expectations at the time, and then also not always being present. The third model is Dolly Madison. So Thomas Jefferson had married when he was younger. His wife died during the Revolution. He never remarried, although he did have a long-term relationship with an enslaved woman named Sally Hemings, who was back at Monticello for perhaps obvious reasons. He did not bring her to the White House. And so his daughters, when they visited on occasion, would serve as his hostess or as his unofficial first lady. But they weren't there that much because they had families of their own. So Dolly Madison, who was the wife of James Madison, who was Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of State, would often stand in, and it gave her some really good practice for what she wanted to do when she was First Lady. Now, this picture is a little bit deceptive. It's a little hard to tell on the screen, but it shows Dolly Madison as being about an inch or two shorter than James Madison. That is hogwash, because James Madison was at most 5'6", probably more like 5'4", and Dolly was probably 5'8", 5'9". She then accentuated that by wearing a turban with giant feathers to make sure that everyone knew exactly where she was. Dolly Madison was not a wallflower. She was a huge personality, but she was not a huge personality in a way that insulted people. For those that met her, almost everyone that met her felt that when they came away from that conversation, they not only felt better about Dolly, but they felt better about themselves, which is an incredible social skill to make people feel valued and seen and heard. Dolly was the biggest asset that James Madison could possibly imagine because he was a brilliant constitutional mind and he was a brilliant congressional politician. But he didn't really have the vibe to really pull off the presidency, if you will. He didn't really have the presence, and she did. So she hosted these incredible salons at the White House, pictured here. They were called her crushes because they were so full that people were actually crushed in the room. And she had outrageous outfits which were designed to be outrageous, to sort of cultivate an environment of what people thought that an American queen might look like. She was brilliant at bringing together different factions, at bringing together different families. She arranged marriages, she arranged alliances, she got things done. So that is the third type of First Lady, which I think is probably pretty rare, and our society does not really permit that type of First Lady anymore, although there are elements of it that we still do see in their successors. So now I kind of want to walk through some other First Ladies and how they have pulled from some of these practices, explore how they have made them their own, and then we will turn at the end to why I think Betty Ford and Abigail are perhaps the most similar. One of the most iconic First Ladies is Eleanor Roosevelt, and I think here she pulls from Dolly Madison as well as Abigail Adams. She was, of course, very involved with politics. She was Franklin Roosevelt's eyes and ears because he was unable to travel around the country, so she did. She would go meet with Americans, she would hear their concerns and their worries, and then bring them back to the White House and share them with Franklin. She was a very important advisor. All evidence suggests he absolutely listened to what she had to say, even if he didn't always follow her advice. And she carved out her own sphere of political influence and was really the first lady to outwardly do so. She did so in a couple of ways. First, she wrote a daily newspaper column for all of the time she was in the White House and then for several decades afterwards. As a writer, I can't even begin to tell you how hard it is to produce that kind of output, let alone producing that output while doing a bunch of other things. So that was a remarkable way to speak directly to the American people and to carve out her own sphere of issues that she was advocating for. She also held regular press conferences for women reporters, and that was because women reporters were not allowed in the White House press pool. And so she said, fine, I will do my own, and only women are allowed. And it made newspapers around the country hire women journalists so that they could attend these press reports and report back on what the First Lady had to say. So not only was she actively involved in the creation of news, but she was actively involved in the cultivation of a whole generation of women journalists. And then, of course, there's her post-presidential career at the United Nations and all of those things. But as First Lady, she was remarkably groundbreaking in what she was able to achieve. And partly, I do think that was because of Franklin's limitations. Had he not been wheelchair bound, I think that there would have been less tolerance probably among the White House staff for her to be out and be so active. But it was really seen that she was serving as his aide in that way, and it gave her a lot of space that I think would not be available for most presidents and First Ladies. Bess Truman was a very different type of First Lady. Bess Truman hated the White House. She hated the presidency. She hated being First Lady. She didn't even really like when Truman was in Congress. She didn't like politics at all. She always preferred to be home in Missouri. She wanted nothing to do with public speaking. When she first took over after FDR died, the staff in the White House said, when are you going to give your press, your first press report? And she said, I'm not. And she refused to have anything to do with it. For all of the evidence that we're able to gather, it seems like they did have a very close and loving relationship, and I do think that Harry Truman valued her input, but from what I can gather, she didn't often offer it on politics and really preferred to be home whenever possible. So this is in some ways what we might kind of think of as an old-fashioned type of being a first lady, but even then, she didn't really even want to embrace the social aspects of Washington, D.C. She felt like the Washington elite looked down on her and disapproved of her more simple clothing and presentation. And so she really kind of rejected everything having to do with the White House. More recently, there is an expectation that first ladies will find issues and causes that they are passionate about. And there are generally certain sections of society that are considered safe for first ladies or appropriate. They are able to focus on children, they are able to focus on education, they are able to focus on sort of children's health-ish, as long as it doesn't get too much into healthcare policy. And these are issues that are considered sort of domestic and so therefore appropriate for first ladies and for women to speak about. And that's not to say that they don't do an incredible amount of good. The Bushes were, I think, an incredible example of what you can do in that sphere. Both women were very involved in children's reading and literacy. Barbara Bush actually had a number of adult literacy programs as well. And they get books into the hands of millions of children. They support education programs around the country and were really lauded for doing so. So I don't in any way mean to disparage those efforts, but they are an example of sort of how first ladies were able to funnel their efforts into a space that was less likely to receive criticism. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't receive criticism at all. Barbara Bush was known as the enforcer. She was the one that would take you to task if you said something about her husband. She was the one that would take you to task if you said something critical about her sons. And she was the one that everyone was afraid of. And from what I understand, having talked to people who knew her for good reason, she was wonderfully warm and loving and an incredible mother and grandmother. But if you got on her wrong side, then you knew it, and you probably wanted to turn and run the other direction. One of the first ladies that struggled with these expectations and the challenges was, of course, Hillary Clinton. She first got into hot water during the campaign when she made a quip about, she wouldn't just be baking cookies, and that didn't go over very well on the campaign trail. Once she was in the White House, she really saw herself as an active partner to Bill Clinton, not unlike Abigail Adams or Eleanor Roosevelt. She actually had an office in the West Wing and was very active in trying to get health care passed. That obviously didn't work, and she was heavily criticized for those efforts. She was seen as an unelected official acting in a political capacity. And so this was an example that many of her successors saw as a cautionary tale about not taking things too far in a certain realm, because you will get blowback. So Michelle Obama was certainly aware of the limitations that had been imposed on Hillary Clinton and was very careful about selecting the issues she cared about. She focused on movement and children's health and trying to get healthy foods and nutritious foods into schools. And yet, even though these are children's issues, even though these are what we might consider to be domestic, she also received criticism for interfering with families, for interfering in local jurisdictions. And so I include this example as a way to demonstrate that even first ladies who are trying to follow all the rules, who are trying to follow all the expectations, it can still sometimes be an utterly impossible job. It's not all bad, though. Some of the most fun parts of the White House are under the First Lady's domain. I think it would be so much fun to oversee the Christmas decorating at the White House because it is extraordinary. And Halloween is probably one of the best times to be there because a lot of the First Ladies will bring in children from local hospitals or children of families whose fathers and mothers are serving overseas. The decorations are unbelievable, and then you get to see really great creative costumes. So, I have a couple of, I think the example of top left was from 2017 when President Trump was in office. There's Mrs. Bush down below. And then I will be honest, I use every opportunity to share this photo because it's my all-time favorite child's Halloween costume. If you all remember, the Pope visited the United States during President Obama's presidency. And so this family very creatively came up with this little white car to be like the mini Pope mobile. And you can see their reaction. It's just such a clever costume. So thank you for allowing me to share the photo once again, because I do think this is one of the more fun parts of being in the White House. And it's worth remembering those moments because sometimes they aren't as frequent as we would like them to be. And that was true for the earliest occupants. So now if we're thinking about how Betty Ford and Abigail Adams offer parallels, I include this quote because it is a great representation that everyone knew Abigail's influence. And sometimes they liked it, and sometimes they did not. And it depended on where she fell on a particular issue and whether or not they agreed with her. So, in 1799, John Adams sent a peace commission to France, and this was during what's called the Quasi-War, when the United States and France were kind of at a naval war, but it hadn't been declared. And Adams understood that a real war would be quite detrimental to the future of the United States, and it was essential to try and have an honorable peace. So he sent a 3-person commission to France, and it split the Federalist Party because the extreme wing of the party really wanted to pursue war because it was good for their electoral prospects. Having a big army was basically a spoils system for the Federalist Party, and they didn't want to give up that opportunity. This was not the army that we have today. It was a very partisan organization. And Adams, defying his party's wishes, did what he thought was best for the good of the nation. He put the Constitution and the country above his own partisan interests, which I'm sure sounds familiar sitting in the Ford Library. Abigail very much supported this choice. She thought that was quite essential. But there was a lot of talk, this is when they were apart, because this was one of the times she was sick. There was a lot of talk in both Massachusetts and Philadelphia that if she had been present, she would have stopped him from doing this because she would have known better. So there's a series of letters where they are writing back and forth, talking about these rumors that they're hearing, and they're laughing about that. So this is her telling him that she has heard this rumor that if the old woman, meaning her, she has a very good sense of humor about her age, was present, that it wouldn't have taken place. And she says, this was pretty saucy. Saucy was one of her favorite words. But the old woman can tell them they are mistaken, for she considers the measure a master stroke of policy. So this was an example where people liked her political influence because they thought she would do something about it. And so I then want to turn to Betty Ford, who used her incredible position for good to defy some of the expectations of women and women in politics at the time. I know you all have probably discussed and read a lot about her battle with breast cancer. And at the time, those words were not to be spoken publicly. Women did not say the word breast out loud in public. You didn't even say the word breast when you were with friends. And so to discuss your own personal health was incredibly taboo. And Betty understood that silence was very detrimental because it meant that women would not share their concerns with their doctors. They would not share their concerns with their loved ones. They would not get concerning lumps checked. And so by sharing her own journey, by being incredibly open about it, she probably saved millions of lives by encouraging women to seek out help early and often in order to prevent the spread of cancer. This political influence wasn't always as well appreciated, however. The next year, Fisher Ames, who was a Federalist in Massachusetts and one of John Adams' former allies and friends, wrote to Rufus King, another Federalist, serving as the ambassador to the United Kingdom. The good lady, his wife, has been often talkative in a similar strain, and she is as complete a politician as any lady in the old French court. This was not a compliment. The ladies in the French court were seen as a overly sexualized version of a woman. They were seen as too involved with politics. They had left the domestic sphere and were engaged in all types of affairs and conniving and corruption, and they were a symbol of what was wrong with the old French system. French lady was also a nod to a prostitute. So he was either saying that she was inappropriately political and had lost her morals, or that she was a prostitute. You can decide which is worse. And I think this is a great example of sometimes they liked her influence and sometimes they didn't, depending on whether or not she agreed with them. And by 1800, they all understood that she was very much on John Adams' side and was not going to help them, and therefore turned against her political mind. This was not all dissimilar to Betty Ford's role in the efforts to try and get the ERA passed. As Gleave said in his introduction, she was very active in trying to get the amendment both passed through Congress and then ratified. The picture on the right shows her making a number of phone calls to try and gin up support, both at the congressional and state level. And what I think is really interesting about this progression is that initially the ERA was not a controversial amendment. It was not seen as something that was particularly politicized. Everyone expected that it would be ratified, and it wasn't until a movement by activists led by Phyllis Schlafly and a number of others kind of swung a ton of momentum against it that ratification actually became a contentious or controversial question. And so initially, Betty's support for the ERA was not controversial until it was. And then her role in politics, her calls, her interference were criticized. Never mind the fact that she was a citizen, that American citizens are allowed their vote and their voice, and they are permitted to have opinions. And just because one is a first lady, one does not stop having opinions or a vote or a right to share your voice. And so I think her role in this moment demonstrates the double-sided coin that can be available to first ladies about their participation. And then I have to end with my very favorite photo of Betty here. And I include this, as you all may know, I believe that I think I get this story correct, but I'm sure you all will tell me if I err, that on their last day in the White House, Betty went into the cabinet room. This is the cabinet room, cabinet table, and as a former dancer, went up on the cabinet table and did a little dance. And I love that because she had such a vibrant, sharp, saucy personality, not unlike Abigail Adams, and was not ever afraid to show it, was not afraid to be herself, even if that meant that she was sometimes going to be controversial or unpopular. And I certainly think that she was better for it. I think that Jerry Ford was better for it, and I think that we as a country were better for it. So with that, I am now going to turn to your questions about First Ladies, about Abigail, about Betty, anything in between. Oh, reminder, please wait for the microphone because we want to make sure we capture your questions. I've left us plenty of time, so there will be no rush, and hopefully we can get everyone involved. Thank you. Looks like we have one in the back here.
Do you know if Eleanor Roosevelt wrote all her columns herself, or did she have ghostwriters, and is that how she was able to do it for so long?
I'm pretty sure she wrote them herself. She did have secretaries who I think helped with transcribing, so she would often write out a first draft, and they would sometimes clean up any grammar mistakes or write it more cleanly to be sent to the newspaper. It's possible they also helped with generation of ideas. Sometimes the hardest thing as a writer is figuring out what to write about, especially if you're writing every day. And so I think they probably helped with generation of ideas. But no, I'm pretty sure she wrote them all herself. Now they weren't 2,000 word articles. I think most of them were sort of in the 550 to 750 word range, but still, that is a remarkable output. I'm not that thorough, guys.
Could you tell us a little bit about Mary Todd Lincoln?
Ah, yes. So, Mary Todd Lincoln, who actually preferred to go as Mary Lincoln. Todd was something that was sort of added to her name later, actually as an effort to smear her because the Todd family had Confederate connections. And so as a way to smear her reputation, people started to refer to her as Mary Todd. She went by Mary Lincoln. Mary Lincoln was a very complicated woman. She was a very smart woman. She did have a very active interest in politics. And from what I can tell, when she and Abraham Lincoln did talk about politics, she was actually a pretty savvy observer, especially of Congress, and a pretty good asset. Their relationship was quite tempestuous, and she struggled with what it meant to be a first lady in Civil War. So, for example, if I go back to this picture of Dolly Madison continued to host her crushes through the War of 1812 as a way to try and inspire patriotism and improve morale. The problem, that worked because often the war was very far away from Washington, D.C. There wasn't photography, there wasn't radio, not that there was radio during the Civil War, but there wasn't the sort of advanced technology, telegraphs that would allow for the immediate amount of information to go from one place to another. And the war looked very different. If we think about the way the Revolutionary War was fought, it's not that it wasn't deadly, but the scale of the battles, and I say Revolutionary War because often that's an image we have a little bit more clearly in our mind, and the War of 1812 was very similar in terms of technology to the Revolutionary War. The scale of battle, the scale of the numbers of the people involved, and the sheer violence was quite different than the Civil War. The advent of new forms of destruction made it much deadlier. And so when Mary Todd Lincoln tried to then host these parties at the White House under the theory that it would improve morale, it didn't quite work as well when you have soldiers literally camped out on the mall in your backyard of the White House, or you have wounded soldiers right down the street. So I think she was, in some ways, not helped by the time in which she was First Lady. She was not helped by their tempestuous marriage. And her reputation was very much shaped by how the cabinet viewed her and how they handled Lincoln's death. So Lincoln's cabinet did not care for Mary Lincoln. And when he died, they basically shut her out of all decision-making and then spoke very poorly of her afterwards. And so that's not to suggest that she was an easy woman or she made all of the right choices. I don't think she did. But I think our vision of her, our image of what we cultivate in our minds, is often biased by some of the men around Lincoln who wanted to claim the role of discussing his legacy and didn't want her to be a part of it. Question down here? Yeah.
We speak the First Lady, it's very formal, and yet so many of them were moms. And could you say anything about how they treated motherhood? We've had a number of First Ladies who were mothers of some wonderful kids.
Yes, thank you. Well, and thank you actually for drawing attention to ladies. So that was a very intentional choice that they started to describe the wives of presidents as lady. And this was in the United States in the 1780s and 1790s. They were trying to define and craft an American culture from scratch. That's really hard to do, because most people that lived in the colonies prior to the Revolution considered themselves to be the most loyal British subjects. So in the time span of really 10 to 15 years, they had completely changed how they thought of themselves. But they were thinking of how they thought of themselves vis-a-vis Great Britain, not as something standing on its own. So one of the tasks of Washington and the people around him in the first administration was to try and craft an American culture so that people understood what the nation was and what they were, separate from their relationship to Britain. And part of that was this American court culture. They called it the Republican court. Now, they didn't want to have an official aristocracy. That is both not allowed in the Constitution and not what they were trying to create. But they did want to have some sort of eliteness. It couldn't really go to the men because they were going to be the office holders. So you have titles like Mr. President, which is quite simple. But it could go to the women. So Martha Washington was called Lady Washington. Lady is typically a title in Britain that denotes an actual title, like an aristocratic title. In the United States, it does not. It was an honorific. So that's where First Lady comes from. In terms of mothers and grandmothers, because by the time Martha Washington was in the White House, she was bringing her grandchildren with her, it is seen as an almost essential component to what it means to be a first lady, because there are, in our society, we still have a lot of questions about women who don't have children. We are a little uncomfortable with that. And so it's one of the reasons you see a lot of women going into politics after they have had children and raised them to at least somewhat adulthood, because they've done the thing that we expect women to do first. And it's not to say that one shouldn't be a mother. I in no way, again, need to denigrate that part of one's life, but it is an expectation we have. And so we actually saw this in the most recent presidential campaign, that Kamala Harris was criticized for only being a stepmother, for not being a real mother. And so, therefore, women and grandchildren are a central part of White House culture. You see pictures, of course, with families there. It can be a wonderful place to raise children, but also a difficult one, because I think Michelle Obama called it, I don't know the exact words that she used, but it's basically a very glorious prison, because you often can't leave because of Secret Service protection. There are, fences and bulletproof windows, but it's a beautiful space. It's a historic space. The gardens are lovely. And some of my favorite pictures of presidents are when they do have children and grandchildren around. So the Eisenhowers, for example, loved when their family would come to visit, and they would usually spend the holidays in the White House. There's pictures of the Eisenhower grandchildren there. The Kennedy pictures, of course, with Jack underneath the desk is one of the most iconic White House photos. So, and it was always intended to also be a family home in addition to a state home. And perhaps no person better identified that than Theodore Roosevelt, who filled the house with many rambunctious children and their insane number of pets. They had a one-legged rooster named Elihu Yale, after the founder of Yale University. They had macaws, they had ponies, they had all kinds of dogs, including a Newfoundland, and the children would sneak like goats up into the residence. So when we talk about sort of the epitome of family life, I always think about the Roosevelt family. Is that a question over here?
What's your take on the argument that Edith Wilson was the first female president of the United States?
Yeah. So I don't think she was the official first female president because she wasn't elected, and that's the hard part. Ruling or governing is not the hard part. I have no doubt that women can do that. It's the electable part that I think we are still working on as a society. But she has, until recently, been a relatively underappreciated figure, probably had a little bit of a constitutional coup going on there, because Woodrow Wilson was severely incapacitated by a series of strokes, and based on the reporting and the doctor's reports at the time, really was unable to make decisions or to speak. And yet, people would bring her documents for him to review and decisions to make, and she would take them to him and come back with his decision. But if he couldn't speak and he wasn't really functioning, it's not clear how he was making those decisions. So I think she probably was acting as president. And that is certainly a constitutional moment worth noting, but I don't necessarily see her as the first female president. Back here?
I'd like to ask you to speak about John Quincy Adams and his wife. I'm sure you're aware that there's a new biography out that's very impressive, and most of us, or many of us, know that John Quincy Adams had a brilliant intellect. But would you speak about how his wife helped him be successful as a president and a diplomat?
it would be a joy, because John Quincy Adams is perhaps, when people ask me, who's your favorite president? I say, well, do you mean the best or do you mean the most interesting? Because I think the best are Washington and Lincoln, but the most interesting, I think, are Theodore Roosevelt and John Quincy Adams. And my dog's name is John Quincy Dog Adams. Quincy for short. And takes after his namesake, way too smart for his own good, often pretty stubborn, and has very strong opinions. So Louisa Catherine Adams was one of 2 first ladies who was born outside of the United States. She was an American citizen because she was born to 2 American parents, but she was born and raised in London. And they, from what we can tell, I believe had a very loving and warm relationship, but it was also sometimes difficult, as any marriage with John Quincy Adams would have been, because he was not always the easiest person. However, she, as you said, was absolutely essential to his political success, because the culture that Dolly Madison crafted of having social events that were dominated by women continued after Dolly Madison was no longer First Lady. And there was still an expectation that political candidates wouldn't necessarily campaign themselves, but that their supporters and their wives would host giant parties as a way to cultivate support for their candidacy. So she hosted a number of parties for John Quincy Adams when he was Secretary of State, to start to build up his name identification, to start to build connections and good rapport with other congressmen. And the most famous one, of course, was when it was a party in honor of Andrew Jackson, who was the hero of the War of 1812. And these parties were so popular that they actually had to add an extension onto their house so that they would have a bigger room to be able to have more people, because everyone wanted to come to them. So she made his success as a politician possible. She made his election in 1824 possible. And most importantly, he knew it. I think we have time for one more question. I'll answer quickly.
I've been told and believe that President Ford had great respect for Dwight Eisenhower. Mm-hmm. I'm interested in whether or not Betty and Mamie had any relationship, and I'm also interested, are there any notable relationships between First Ladies, either good or bad, throughout our history?
It's a great question. I believe you are correct that Ford had a tremendous amount of respect for Eisenhower. I think that most Americans did, especially most Americans who served. He was widely respected and loved. I have no idea what Betty's relationship was, if anything, with Mamie. Mamie was a very different type of wife. Mamie was a very old-fashioned military wife in that she was not involved with politics. Her job was to be the wife at home, to raise the children, to do the social rounds, but they had completely different schedules. They cared about completely different things. They had very independent lives, which is not to say they had a bad marriage. I don't think that they did. It was just they had a very different type of marriage. So I don't know that Betty, at the very least, would have seen her as a model to emulate. I don't know of that many, well, I know that Martha and Abigail got along perfectly well. A lot of the later First Ladies, Dolly Madison lived in Washington, D.C. at the end of her life after James died, and a lot of them would go visit with her and enjoyed her company a great deal. There are some examples of more recent First Ladies who did not care for one another, including Barbara Bush and Nancy Reagan were famously quite unpleasant to one another. But I think more recently, I think Laura Bush was incredibly welcoming to Michelle Obama, so they have a very good relationship, and Michelle Obama really appreciated how much the Bushes went out of their way to make the family welcome. And I think there is a certain camaraderie, at least among some, for an understanding of the unique challenges and opportunities for the role. There is, of course, the circle of presidents. I think there's also, maybe not all of them, but a circle of First Ladies. So with that, I will hand it over to Gleaves for closing remarks.
You mentioned the word pleasant. I think we all had a very pleasant experience with you on the stage. Thank you so much. I can't think of a greater tribute to Betty Ford than to compare her to Abigail Adams, and I can't think of a better tribute to Abigail Adams than to compare her to Betty Ford. So well done. Now, we've got a couple of things to follow. So you'll certainly want to get more into the story by purchasing a copy of Lindsay's book. It'll be out here in the lobby, and she'll be available to sign. And while you're waiting for the book to be signed, celebrate Betty Ford's 107th birthday. We have cupcakes. We got vanilla cupcakes. We've got chocolate cupcakes, if I don't get to the chocolate first. And just have great time, you know, enjoying each other's company. And as Joel said, we have a lot of programs coming up. And so we'll see you at the next programs. Thank you so much.